All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys some more about Germany and Iran. This is a topic that I find very fascinating, and I have been talking about this topic and writing about this topic for a little bit now, and I find this to be a very, very interesting subject because we are talking about the revival of German power. We are talking about how Germany, having this very close relationship to Iran, is actually a reflection of how Germany really hasn't entirely changed from its ways of the past. Because Iran is the Iranian government is the only government that will proclaim its desire to attack Israel and wipe out the Jews and bomb Tel Aviv. I've seen the videos online of Iranian Shiite fanatics speaking in such ways, and I've watched a video of a Shiite Iranian singer talking about how Iran is going to wipe Tel Aviv off the map. Iran is the only country where its government will openly talk in such a way, and where really prominent people, famous people, will openly speak in such a way. And it is supported tremendously by much of the general population. And here is Germany, one of the most wealthiest countries in the world, one of the manufacturing powerhouses of the world. Here is Germany, the most powerful economy in all of Europe, having an alliance with the Iranians, to the ire and frustration and anger and vexation of the United States. And remember, we had the Iran deal in 2015. The Germans were very, very enthusiastic about it. They said, yes, this is great. And the Iran deal was good in the sense that it tried to keep Iran under control. The United States pulled out of the Iran deal under Trump in 2018. And the Iranians said, okay, so if you're not going to honor the deal, why the hell should we even, follow you? Why should we even honor the Iran deal? So now the Iranians have already exceeded their nuclear production against the rules of the Iran deal, against the rules of the International Atomic Energy Association, and or however you say the title of that organization. Anyway, so now you have an even more aggressive Iran, and the problem is that Iran backs anti-American, anti-Israel terrorist organizations in the Middle East, especially Hezbollah and Hamas. Iran will also back Shiite militias in Iraq, and these Shiite militias will kill American soldiers. Well, they have actually attacked American soldiers, killed American soldiers, and they will attack and kill our allies, etc., etc. So, because of this, the Americans have put a lot of pressure against Iran by imposing sanctions and also by pressuring other countries not to do any sort of commerce with Tehran, with the Iranians. The Germans have been at the forefront of resisting this American imposition. The Germans have been saying, no, to hell with you, we're not going to listen to you. And Germany is still Iran's number one European commercial partner. And for a while, you can go all the way back to the 1980s, you will see that Germany was a very, very strong commercial partner with the Iranians. And this has been quite a common trend that's been taking place for decades, actually. So the Germans and the Iranians have actually had close ties for over a century now. You can go all the way back to the 1870s, and then economic ties between the Iranians and between the Iranians and the Germans really, really began to accelerate by the 1920s. And then when Hitler takes power, the Iranians really, really love Germany. I mean, they really love Germany because in Adolf Hitler, they saw someone who could have defeated the British and the Russians, because the Iranians hated the British and the Russians, because the British and the Russians were always trying to control Iran to take the oil. They wanted the oil from Iran, and eventually the British and the Russians did take over Iran, and they threw out all of the Nazis because there were many Nazis in Iran who were working with the Iranians, and there were many Iranians who were collaborating with the Nazis. Eventually, the British and the Russians invaded Iran, and they threw out all of the German operatives who were in Iran, or at least they got most of them out. There were probably some operatives that they missed, who knows. So fast forward to the 1990s, East and West Germany reunify, and German-Iranian relations really continue on. They don't really go away. In fact, the Germans were actually very adamant about maintaining that alliance with the Iranians. But the problem was that in the 1980s, there was a number of terrorist attacks in Lebanon that killed hundreds of American soldiers. So, for example, in the 1980s, there were a Shiite terrorist who did a terrorist attack in the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon, and that killed around 50 Americans. And then you had the suicide attack on the American and French military headquarters in Lebanon that slaughtered hundreds of American soldiers. Okay, over 200 American soldiers were killed in the military barracks attack in Lebanon. And so in the mid 1990s, the Clinton administration said we don't want to have any sort of dealings with Iran because the terrorists who did those attacks in Lebanon were Shiites who were backed by the Iranian regime. And the Clinton administration said, okay, we don't want anyone else, we don't want any of our allies to be doing business with the Iranians. And the Americans began to pressure the Germans to cease all economic ties with the Iranians. And the Germans were extremely stubborn, and they were very adamant about not listening to the Americans. They refused to acquiesce. And it got so bad that the United States government even presented proof to the Germans, substantiating how the Iranian government was the one backing these terrorists, how these terrorists in Lebanon who killed hundreds of American soldiers were proxies for the Iranian regime, and this is the reason why you should stop doing business with them. And the Germans still did not give a damn. They didn't care. And I want to read to you guys some excerpts from this book I've been reading. I'm almost done with it. It's called Germany and Iran by Matthias Kunzel. Very good read. I'd recommend it to people who want to study how the past and the present connect, because when we think about Germany, we think, those guys, they're not Nazis anymore, there's no Nazis left in Germany. Germany's a modern country. They are advancing towards protecting democracy around the world. They want to be a force for democracy. They're a great NATO partner, they're a great NATO ally, etc. But it's very difficult to look past that. It's very difficult to look past the curtain of diplomacy and modern day political jargon and to see between the lines. You have to read between I was about to say lions, but you have to see between the lines. And one thing that you will notice after years or months of reading political quagmire and rhetoric and diplomatic talk and conversation and discourse, one thing that you will notice in all of that is that things are very well cloaked with polite language. Things are extremely well cloaked in very cordial discourse and conversation and statements of alliances and statements of the balance of power and stability and being a force for peace and democracy and all these things. But you should not just look at what people say. You should also look at what people do or what people don't do. And the fact is that Iran is a country that has a strong history to Nazi Germany. During the Second World War, the Iranians, many of them, were obsessed with the idea of being Aryan. They were obsessed with the idea they were obsessed about the idea of the Germans being Aryans and related to Iranians, and they saw Hitler as an Aryan. And there were even imams in Iran who were saying that Hitler is the 12th Imam that we have been waiting for all of this time. He is the Messiah. And it was insane. It was completely insane. But the thing is that legacy in Iran is still there today. Obsession with being Aryan, obsession with Aryanism, obsession with Aryan race theory, like all of these things are still there. They are still there. In fact, I just want to add this real quick. There's this thing that Kuntzel talks about in his book. It's called the Mykonos affair. And this was a very tense political situation between Germany and Iran that took place in the 90s. So basically what happened was that there were these Kurdish activists who were murdered in Germany. They were Kurdish activists who were against the Ayatollah Khomeini regime, or the Ayatollah regime, and they were in Germany, and they were murdered in a restaurant in Germany. They were murdered in a Greek restaurant in Germany, and this is why it's called the Mykonos affair, because the murder took place in a Greek restaurant. So for a long time, they were wondering in the 90s, a big story in Germany was who murdered these two activists in Germany, and there was a lot of talk about how the murderers were members of Iranian intelligence, and there were people in the German government who were saying Iran had a role to play in this. Well, the Iranians didn't like that, and there were all these protests that erupted in Qum, in the city of Qum in Iran, and they were saying death to this German politician, death to this person, etc., etc. So the German government had to issue an apology to the Iranians, because the Germans, they don't want to lose that alliance. They want to maintain that alliance with the Iranians. So the Germans, they issued an apology. And they said, we're sorry. Well, I don't think they said we are sorry like that, but they said, we really value the alliance that we have, the partnership that we have with Iran. We love the people of Iran, et cetera, et cetera. So the Ayatollah Khamenei, he took the statement in his hand, and he said, here, the Germans are our friends. We are both Aryans, and Germans are Aryans, and we are Aryans, and we're brothers. And this happened in the 90s. So Aryan race obsession, it's still in Iran. And what's very interesting is when the Clinton administration was trying to pressure the Germans to cease economic ties with the Iranians, there was one German politician, I'm going to get to who he was in a moment here, but there was one German politician who said, well, we have this 100-year alliance. We have this 100-year partnership with Iran, and we don't want to lose that. We want to maintain that. Well, that 100-year partnership would include the Third Reich. So the Germans were literally referencing the Nazi past in order to justify the partnership with Iran. So we have to read between the lines when looking into the facade of Europe. I did a video about Africa and how Africa sucks. Europe is different in the sense that there's civilization, there's order, there's more, and there's better infrastructure, much better infrastructure. But at the same time, that politeness can be used as a cover to masquerade very, very destructive policies and very destructive alliances, like, for example, Germany and Iran. What's very interesting is that what happened in 2018, 2019, what's still actually happening between Germany and the US over Iran happened in the 1990s. So German-American tensions over Iran is nothing new. They erupted in 2018 with Trump pulling the U.S. out of the Iran deal, but they also erupted in the 1990s when Clinton was president and when Clinton was trying to pressure the Germans to stop economic ties with the Iranians. So this is something that's been ongoing for a long time. This is not a new phenomenon. I just think today because of Brexit, because of the instability of NATO, because of the instability of the European Union, the fragmentation of the European Union. I think that this rift, this tension between the U.S. and Germany is only going to accelerate into a. It's going to accelerate worse and worse. So I want to read to you guys some excerpts from this. It talks about how this German official in 1996 traveled to the United States when these tensions were in the political atmosphere. And it says here, in May 1996, a determined Klaus Kinkel traveled to the United States to announce German countermeasures. The American officials with whom Kinkel talked, quote, had very clearly understood that Europe would respond with sharp retaliatory measures against the United States. 2 weeks later, Chancellor Kohl, and I'll get to him in a moment because there's an interesting thing about Kohl. Chancellor Kohl flew to the United States in order to lend extra weight to the German threats. With success, at the end of the Kohl-Clinton summit, the American president retreated, promising that, quote, he wished to apply the laws in a way that does not harm our partners. The new sanctions law thereby lost its teeth, and German firms were able to continue doing business with the mullah's dictatorship unhindered. So Chancellor Kohl goes to the United States and he tells the Americans, if you try to stop us, there's going to be consequences. And the Americans, of course, did not want to lose that alliance with Germany. It's very important that the United States maintains an alliance with Germany because America needs to control Germany. If you don't control Germany, Germany is going to become a nuclear country. Germany is going to become more nationalistic. Germany is going to become more competitive against the United States. Germany is going to take over all of Europe, or it's going to control much of Europe, and it's going to do so not just with a powerful economy, but with a powerful military force, with the fear of a German military threat. So I want to talk a little bit more about Helmut Kohl. Very interesting fact about Kohl. When Germany reunited, when East and West Germany reunited in 1990, Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, refused to agree to honor Polish territory. So I want to read to you guys a quote from an article that I wrote back in August of 2020. And I'll put the link to the article in the description so you guys can read more. But here's an excerpt from the article. On February 2nd of 1990, Margaret Thatcher wrote that with a reunified Germany, quote, Germany's ambitions would then become the dominant and active factor, unquote. Thatcher publicly stated in a March 26, 1990 interview with Der Spiegel that in a private conversation she had with Chancellor Kohl, that he told her that he did not recognize the Oder-Neisse border with Poland, which was established by the Allies after the Second World War. Kohl angrily denied saying this, but his denial is quite doubtful, for when the Prime Minister of Poland, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, asked Kohl to vow that Germany will never try to retake Polish territory after reunification, Kohl refused. As was reported by the LA Times, quote, Mazowiecki had called on Kohl to issue a guarantee as leader of the West German government that a reunited German state would not seek to recover territory in Western Poland that was part of the Germany before its defeat in World War II. Kohl had refused, saying that legally such matters had to be decided by the government of a reunited nation. So this Kohl guy was such a German nationalist that he even refused to make an agreement with Poland that a reunited Germany would not try to retake Polish territory. And this was the same Kohl who was adamant about maintaining an alliance with Iran. Now, some people could argue that this alliance between Germany and Iran is strictly economic. But that assumption, I think, is really a half-truth. Yes, of course, the German-Iranian alliance does involve money, right? It involves billions of dollars. But it's more than that. I think it's also ideological. So I want to read to you guys an excerpt from this book, Germany and Iran by Matthias Kunzel. So it says here that after the Clinton administration acquiesced and said, okay, Germany can do business with Iran, it says here that the United States persisted. According to Warren Christopher, the American Secretary of State from 1993 to 1997, quote, we constantly prodded them, i.e. the Germans and the French, to distance themselves from Iran and to suspend trade as we had done. In private meetings, we shared with them evidence gathered by our intelligence agencies showing Iran's link to such Middle East terrorist groups as Hamas and Hezbollah. Unfortunately, the struggle to stop our allies from doing business with Iran has not yet succeeded, unquote. And so the author goes on to ask the question, why was preference instead given to a partner that maintained a positive attitude towards the Nazis and their racial ideology? The economic explanation is unconvincing. The value of German exports to Iran fell from 8 billion Deutschmarks in 1992 to 2.2 billion in 1996. Iran placed 45th in Germany's export and 49th in its import league table. Economic interests cannot fully account for why Germany has adhered to a policy so much criticized in the United States. And economic interests do not explain why engagement is the widely preferred approach in the German debate about dealing with Iran, stated Peter Rudolph, a member of Germany's leading think tank, Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, in April 1997. So what then is the explanation? In Mousavian's view, Mousavian was a major Iranian politician. In Mousavian's view, quote, the particular engagement of Germany had deeper institutional, ideological, and historical roots, unquote. Peter Rudolph gives a similar answer. This policy can only be explained in light of historically rooted strategic preference. And was it not precisely such a historically rooted strategic preference to which Rafsanjani, who was the president of Iran at that time, was alluding when he talked about the two countries' strategic alliance in the Second World War? So there you go. It's not just economic. There's history to this. There's a century-old, more than a century-old, history between Germany and Iran, and that includes the Third Reich. That includes Iran looking up to the Germans as the apex of Aryanism, the apex of Aryan power against the enemies of Iran, the British, the Americans. And this history continues on with today having the Germans still resisting American pressure to cease ties with the Iranians. And it has come to the point where, and I've talked about this before, Jean-Claude Juncker, when Jean-Claude Juncker in 2018, who was then the president of the EU Commission, stating that Europe must replace the United States. So we're seeing really the connection between the past and the present. And we must look beyond the facade of diplomatic politeness, and see that history doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. It definitely rhymes. And I'll leave it at that. You guys have just heard some theology. God bless.